My name is Brian McGrory. I'm the editor of The Globe, and we all at The Globe really appreciate your coming out tonight. It ends up all we needed to do to resolve the region's epic traffic congestion was to throw a couple of days of moderately bad weather at us, and we're all set. So at The Globe, we do a few major takeouts a year. Big projects, multi-part series, spotlight reports. They come to us in all different ways. The best usually arrive from outside tips, often anonymously, and guide us toward wrongdoing done by some sort of agency or prominent person. Sometimes reporters bring in stories or series from their daily beats, like the marijuana series we did earlier this year by Spotlight. Sometimes even an editor has an idea, even this editor. Sometimes it's something right in front of her or him. In this case, it was a commute from the western suburbs. Over a number of years, it grew worse and worse, gradually then suddenly. I spent so much time sitting on the Mass Pike that I thought I was going to get a property tax bill from the town of Newton. So I called in Globe Spotlight editor Patty Wen, who is a force of nature and one of the best journalists I have ever met. I asked her and her team to take a look at the epic traffic issues we're facing in Greater Boston, how they affected the very sense of security we had, our economy, our psyche. I asked her to waste absolutely nothing in going after this. Travel wherever you need to go in the world, get up in the air with helicopters and drones, take a look at mergers on highways, one-way streets in cities, synchronized lights, anything that works or doesn't work, figure it out and fix everybody's commute. It was an easy charge. Months went by. I saw all sorts of activity on the part of the team, and we put a really good team together. Andrew Ryan, Nicole Dungca, Adam Vaccaro, Rebecca Ostreicher, and Patty. Finally, 6 months in, Patty came to my office and said we needed to talk. You have a fix, I said. I do, she said. Get out of your car, you need to stop driving. Which is why you'll now find me on the commuter rail several days a week since I started taking a look at the story. And I regularly send Patty the pictures to prove it because she's ever skeptical. It came down to what Adam Vaccaro had told me all along: too many cars, not enough pavement. It was a public policy, there was a need for public policy change, and the Globe Spotlight team pushed us towards that, which we're all very proud of. The result was a 3-part series looking at government's role, looking at private industry, and looking at technology and how it will affect traffic congestion in the years ahead. We got a lot of help on this series, and I'm thrilled that representatives from the Walsh administration and the Baker administration are participating in tonight's event, as well as some really smart activists who've been talking about this issue for a long time. Before we start the program, I would like to thank Cross Insurance for being a supporter. I'm also told that I'm to tell you that there are exits on either side of me up here. And one last thing, this kind of journalism, we believe, is vital to the health of a community. And at the Globe, we benefit enormously from the outsized support of our readership. We get more support from our digital readers and print readers than any other major metropolitan newspaper in America. That allows us to triple the size of the Spotlight team and other accountability we do at the Globe. And we will do a lot more. We have another Spotlight series coming early in the winter. I assume if you're here, you're probably a subscriber. But if you're not, please come see me because I have a deal for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Globe's star business columnist, Shirley Leung, who has been banging the drum on traffic congestion for years, and she will moderate 2 panels tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, and congratulations on getting on the commuter rail. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel, and then I have a couple more housekeeping items. This is Andrew Ryan. Do a little wave. He covered City Hall before joining Spotlight. We have Nicole Dungca, who is covered transportation before joining Spotlight. And we have Adam Vaccaro, who currently covers transportation for the Globe and was on loan to Spotlight. We missed you.
I'm back.
A couple things. When you came in your brochures, there was an index card. And I know a bunch of you probably submitted questions online before you arrived, but but if you come up with questions tonight, you can write them on your index card, and we will have staff collecting them during tonight's event. And then we're going to have panel 1 with the spotlight reporters, a little bit about the story behind the story, and then we'll have panel 2 with our city and state officials and activists, and then we'll deal with questions from the audience at the end. I'm sorry we won't have mics available for everybody, but we will have those questions on cards and we can read them out loud. Anyways, let's start with the first question here, which is traffic is a ginormous subject. And so when you guys got your marching orders from Brian and Patty, I mean, where did you begin?
I mean, I think I can start as, so I'm the only one who hasn't covered transportation. So my knowledge of the transportation system was just on the way that I used it. So I think that can you guys hear me all right? Great. So I was the only reporter on the team, or one of the reporters on the team, who hadn't covered transportation as a beat. So I didn't know the nuances anywhere near as well as Nicole or Adam. So I think that we started, as we often do, just by trying to learn as much as we could about the topic, by kind of reading what has been written, but then also really trying to think of a different way at it. And I mean, one of the things that we wanted to do was we have Adam covering transportation, and he ends up writing a lot about the MBTA. And especially in conversations with Brian, we wanted to take a hard look at it from the perspective of driving, and to try to get a sense from kind of what the broader impact of that is. And kind of, because that's what we kept hearing from our neighbors, from our sources, just from our own experience, was that, as Brian said, that we could feel ourselves that traffic kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so we wanted to understand why and what potentially could be done about it.
I mean, like the Globe Spotlight series on race, a lot of the series was based on data, original data collection. Can someone talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know every time we do a Spotlight series, we always want to have a lot of data. We don't want it to be anecdotes, people just noticing that you have a lot of Ubers and Lyfts on the streets, or that there are a lot of delays. And so what we actually did when we first started was just collecting a ton of data on, for example, how many cars there are now in the city versus in 2010, and just the idea that over the past 5 years, for example, there are over 300,000 more cars in the region. And so being able to show people these actual numbers, I think, allows people to see this is really just a problem. It's not just a feeling you have when you're on the pike and hate everything. Like, it's actually something that can be quantified.
And I thought what was a really original part of the series was to go after lawmakers and poll and do a survey and ask them about their own habits. Tell us a little bit more about that and what you learned from that.
Yeah, excuse me. I think that the goal of that was to try and just get a sense for how it is that the people who are making decisions about transportation are experiencing the transportation system. I don't think it necessarily is a value judgment necessarily on any of them, but it does help us understand their perspective a little bit better as they approach these problems. It also, in some cases, speaks to individual choices, which is something we wanted to call out in this series. Each and every one of us makes a choice about how we commute to the extent that we can. And in a lot of cases, there are public officials who could make a different choice and do make the choice that they do. And to the extent that that's reflective of the broader commuting population, it seemed worth calling out.
As I mentioned, Nicole, you used to cover transportation. Adam, you currently cover transportation. So when you did this series, what surprised you the most? What were some of the findings that surprised even experts like yourself?
Well, I think we talked about this. When you end up covering transportation, just a whole bulk of your time is just talking about the MBTA, talking about Keolis. And so being able to go into different areas to talk about cars, to talk about Ubers and Lyfts, I think brought some new numbers to the fore for me. Just again, being able to quantify, like in 2012, there were maybe 14 million cab rides that were given. And to know that Uber and Lyft now has just surpassed that. Now in 2018, 42 million rides by Ubers and Lyfts were given in the city of Boston, while there were only 4.8 cab rides. So being able to see those kinds of numbers just shows you something that you know, like that Ubers and Lyfts are so ubiquitous, but you can actually show it to people that these kinds of companies have just completely changed the transportation landscape, and we have to pay attention to it and the kind of policies we have so that we can properly move people in this city.
I would say one of the things that I was surprised about as somebody who looks at commuting every day and sort of thinks of it as a very dynamic process was to learn how predictable we are in some ways. And this was really spelled out when we looked at commuter benefits. I was able to find some research from a bunch of other cities that showed that if you give people a transit pass but no parking, they will take transit more often. If you give them a parking pass but no transit, they'll park more often. If you give them both, they'll park more often, which is kind of telling. And then what was really interesting was we had already surveyed a bunch of companies to sort of understand their own benefits and the effects of them. And just learning that information and then putting it side by side with those companies and seeing that it was more or less reflected there sort of drove home the idea that in some ways we are participants in the system without even realizing it sometimes, it felt like.
And so with these, both the Uber and Lyft, and the rise in Uber and Lyft, and what you saw with employers and their policies, I mean, what kind of fixes do you think, what should happen next, I guess, to kind of fix these problems?
So do you mean specifically on Uber and Lyfts?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if anyone has quite figured that out yet. It's, I mean, I know like in London, for example, they just, I think, basically canceled their license, which was kind of an extreme case. And I think that is kind of happening in real time now. Certainly there are, I know that, and Nicole focused on this mostly, but I know that, that we had initially had some high fees per ride, and I think we've been surpassed by some other cities. I know the city has piloted some, pick off and drop off zones, and there's certainly, and things have been changed by Massport at the airport. But I guess what's clear is just even as when I am walking or driving in the city, I mean, you can tell not just Uber and Lyfts, but just all of the, the delivery vans, whether it's UPS or white vans, and how much they have just changed the dynamics, and how much you feel just at 6 o'clock at night, streets that are already narrowed are pinched even more. So I think some places have made strides, but obviously I think that we need to, go further to really kind of deal with this issue. And I know that there are some proposals at both the city and the state level to kind of try to get at this.
One thing that you hear talked about a little bit out there, but I haven't heard talked about much, there's a lot of talk about adding fees to Uber and Lyft rides to sort of discourage them. There's even some talk about making a differential fee based on shared rides or solo rides to sort of encourage carpooling. Out there's a little bit of discourse out there about the idea of whether or not you want to adjust those fees geographically, so try and incentivize rides to transit stations, but punish rides that could be done by transit with really dynamic fees like that. And so that's something that maybe would fall into the public policy realm.
Speaking of Uber and Lyft, it's all of us who use it. It's about it's another form of driving, right? The convenience of driving. And I thought what was terrific about the series is you focused on the psychology of driving and how hard it is to break that habit of driving. So, and a lot of our conversation about traffic and transportation is about fixing the T. So why do you think it was important to focus on the mentality of driving?
So I think that the series in a lot of ways is predicated on the idea that public transit needs to get better. We acknowledge up front that the T has its problems and that reliability, even frequency, those are issues that need to be addressed. That said, there is going to be a future, hopefully, where it operates better. And whether or not we're still in a mindset where we are willing to get it, or whether we're still sort of driven to drive, is going to be a question of public policy that I guess it'll just depend. It'll depend on what kind of incentives are out there. There is some research out there that indicates that if you provide better options, you will still just get a lot of people who say, okay, I hope everybody else takes those better options, rather than encouraging everyone else to take that option. And so that's sort of why I think it was important to get at why people want to opt for the car, carcoon, and all that jazz.
I mean, I think we had a mantra that transit people always know, which is, you are traffic. When you're complaining on the road and you're like, God, all these people are out here, like you're also out there in your car being traffic. So I think that's something that we really wanted to put out into the world, which is, you can't just complain about being out in the car. Sometimes there are people that don't have any other options, but when we're talking about congestion pricing or some of these other things, it's not necessarily for that person. We're talking about the people who might be driving when they might live directly next to some sort of bus line or to a metro stop.
Actually, the Globe was as an employer was a great example of this. When we were on Morrissey Boulevard, we had a big parking lot, so there was free parking for everybody, and almost everybody, including myself, drove. But when we moved downtown to just across the street at 53 State Street, free parking did not come with it. And so we saw a huge shift in the way people got to work, myself included. And it was all about because people weren't willing to, pay to park. And so that had a huge impact on basically how the workforce got to work. And I mean, there are certainly still people who drive, but I think there's a significant amount now who are on the subway, the bus, and the commuter rail.
I mean, it simply became too expensive, right?
Correct, yes.
And it seems like a lot of policies, perhaps that could drive a lot of our policies to get people out of their cars. Day 3 focused on technology and how it's contributed to congestion from Uber and Lyft, but also to delivery trucks, from Amazon and FedEx and UPS. And so I was hoping you could tell us a story of that UPS truck that was in the lead. I think that was the truck with like 1,500 parking tickets in 1 year in the city of Boston. And so, of course, when I read that anecdote, I pictured someone wandering the streets of Boston looking for that truck. So tell us how you found that truck and how did the story unfold from there?
It is indeed kind of a funny story. A couple of us, within a matter of a few days, or it might have even been the same day, were out walking around the neighborhood around the Globe and noticed a UPS truck right in the bus lane with just a bunch of tickets stuffed up against its dashboard, and went, isn't that funny? And we had a database already, I believe, of all the major parking violations in the city. And we're able to plug in the license plate. Our colleague Todd Pollack was able to do this, and was able to identify that as, oh, yep, that's the one. That's the biggest violator in all of Boston. And so then the hard work came with another of our colleagues, Rebecca Ostraker, who she did the hard work of posting up on a Friday in the fall and just following it around, watching it break rules. Although she mentioned that it wasn't even that hard to find it, because all the violations happened in like the same areas, so she was able to just sort of visit one of them, and there it was.
I was hoping you guys could spend a little time talking about the reaction from readers to the series. I think you guys posted an update today, right? Or was it today? Yeah, today from readers. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what struck you about readers' reaction to your series.
I think reaction has been pretty varied. I think this is, transportation and traffic and transit issues are something I think everyone feels. So I think people had a lot to say about it, and they wanted to kind of share their experiences with us. And so I think we certainly felt like we struck a chord And I think that probably Adam and Nicole know this from every time we write about either the MBTA or something traffic related, that this is something that affects everyone's life every single day. Some of the things we heard, so there were some frustrations that we didn't focus on, let's say like the North-South Rail Link or like other kind of aspects or projects. And those are certainly, things that, we wished we could have written about everything, but, in stories, sometimes you have to kind of find a little bit of a focus, because otherwise, if you include everything, it ends up kind of being about nothing. So we had to make some choices. I think one of the things that's come through is that people feel really passionately about this issue, whether it's, either in their car or on public transit or on their bicycles. We could tell that this was certainly something that was worth writing about just by the reaction alone.
I would add just that while not everyone necessarily embraced some of our takeaways, we got the feedback we've gotten so far has been overwhelmingly thoughtful. There's been a lot of ideas-oriented responses to it, solutions, things that could be better, things we hadn't thought about and that we're all ears about. We will continue to report a lot on transportation going forward. And so to the extent that hopefully we stimulated a conversation, that's been reflected so far in the feedback I've seen.
Oh, having covered transportation for 3 years, it's just every time you write something about transit or traffic, you get millions of emails about how people's commutes are bad. And that was the case here, but then there were a lot of people who were appreciative of basically the fact that we focused on this idea that maybe there are different policies. I think that was something we really wanted to do, was to have that accountability piece. This is a spotlight project after all. So we really focused on some of the policies that might enable some of these things. We're talking about the delivery truck. The reason the delivery truck could have so many of those tickets is because they have an agreement with the city of Boston, as they do in many other cities, where they can accrue all those tickets and just pay them off at a certain time without getting booted. So I think people realize that there are ways to kind of change behavior with travel, and that there are ways for governments to do this. And in some ways, they might not necessarily be doing it right now.
But there's, of course, the flip side to that, which is if that UPS truck gets booted, then we might have to wait a little longer for Amazon packages.
Yeah, and then we'd all be really upset,
So after doing this series, are you more hopeful or less hopeful about relieving congestion in a timely fashion in Massachusetts?
We're always hopeful. That's our whole thing.
Define timely?
How about in the next 2 or 3 years? Will my commute get a lot better? Maybe you want to save that for the next panel?
I think that's on them.
Well, okay, wait.
I think I would say what's clear is that this is something that obviously the region cares a tremendous amount about. That it's clear that this is something that our elected leaders care about, and so I think that is certainly hopeful, right? That there are smart people thinking about this, and that people care a lot about it because it impacts everybody.
Because it seems like traffic has been with us for a long time. So but do you feel like we are at a tipping point that true change will happen, or do you think we'll just keep talking about this?
I think that we'll have to wait and see for.
In the next panel, even.
We have Chris Osgood here. He is Chief of Streets for the City of Boston. I love that title, Chief of Streets. Next to him is, actually, I have a little intro. I'm gonna do it out of order. I have Mary Skelton Roberts, who's the co-director of climate at the Barr Foundation with a focus on transportation and land use. We have Bill Strauss, you want to do a little wave, who serves as House Chairman of the Joint Committee on Transportation, and he's the frequent sparring partner with Transportation Secretary Stephanie Pollack. We're lucky to have both of them here tonight on the same panel. Not on opposite sides, hopefully. We'll see. We'll find out. She's in her 5th year as secretary, right? And I think that might be a modern era record, correct? Well, that was a long time ago. Modern era in the last 20 years, right? Anyways, this is our policymakers side of the panel. And remember, I think we are collecting questions. So, you know, and we'll collect another round. We've got some index cards here. Good, good, good. You guys can follow directions. This is great. Anyways, as policymakers, how do you break commuters' addiction to driving? You know, for example, did the city and state make it too easy for all of us to park? Chris,
Sure.
Go ahead.
I can start with that. First of all, I actually want to thank the Globe. The Globe, to their great credit, I think, sort of trained the Spotlight team on what is a really pressing issue for our city, for our region, for our Commonwealth. And I think, as the last panel showed, did a great job in sort of synthesizing, framing, and deepening the conversation around congestion. And I think the solve to congestion sort of embedded in Shirley's question was sort of illustrated in Brian's story, which is that in order for us to really address congestion, we need to shift more people to walking, biking, and transit, which means we need to make those modes simply more appealing to people who are driving today. That means doing things like pricing parking more appropriately, and also doing things like making alternatives like the reliability of bus service on our streets simply work better for people who are riding it. In the city of Boston, some things which we've been doing, a quick example, a few years ago, we did a performance parking pilot in the Back Bay. There is tons of research that says if you price parking appropriately, you will reduce congestion in your city. We changed the pricing of our parking meters. It showed that we actually got a reduction in double parking, a reduction in illegal parking, and better utilization of our curb throughout the Back Bay district. We also were able to invest the revenue from that back into better sidewalks in the Back Bay and throughout the city. We learned from that pilot, and we're able to actually, this July, make it permanent, take the learnings to scale across the city. And as was sort of teased in the Spotlight story, we're now beginning to look at how do we work with developers and how do we work with employers across the entire city to think about how we build the right amount of parking when new development comes online, and how we work with employers today to help their employees best carpool, walk, bike, or take mass transit to work, all of which I think are part of the things that are highlighted in the Spotlight series.
So when people are asked why they drive, there's a handful who say they like it, although given the when people are asked why they drive, there's a handful who say they like it, although I think with congestion the way it is, that's a probably smaller number than there used to be. The number one answer tends to be because I don't have an alternative. So one of the things that we have to focus on is giving people real alternatives to driving, and that has to come either first or simultaneously, right? If you take away everybody's parking space, but imagine the Globe took away your parking spaces and there wasn't a T, right? So that would just leave everybody with really bad choices. So we're really focused on making walking, biking, and transit a much more attractive way of getting places. The other thing I would say is that another point that I thought the series made well, and we also made in our congestion report that we did, is that congestion is a complicated problem, and it's a symptom of a lot of other complicated problems, and there is no one thing that's going to solve it, and there's also no one actor that's going to solve it. So how much parking there is a function of how cities regulate parking, what employers do, and what developers do, and so all those actors have a role to play in changing the amount of parking if we think that's one of the levers that we want to pull in order to change people's travel behavior.
So at the Barr Foundation, we play a really unique role. We are not policymakers. What we see our role as being stewards and catalysts of really good ideas, people that have bold and ambitious plans, and also of a vision of what the future could look like. You asked the question about how do we get people out of their cars? You gotta make transportation a delight to use. And we actually need to stop talking about headways, and we need to stop talking about throughputs. We need to stop talking about traffic, and we need to talk about how people are gonna experience the system. We need to talk about when you're on public transit, you can see this gorgeous city that is Boston. We need to talk to people who are gonna be able to connect with others if they're walking down a sidewalk. We need to be talking about the kinds of experiences people will have and make public transit a delight to use. Other than that, people can't see what the future holds for them. We're talking about traffic congestion. All of that feels like a turnoff for people. You got to tell them what the future looks like.
I also, like Chris, I want to thank the Globe for putting this on. I have to say, as somebody who often gets asked questions, how much I enjoyed watching the first panel receive questions. And even the gaps in sound while they formulated an answer, it was great. But to the topic here, clearly, when you look at the geography of the Boston central area, surrounding area as well, the fact that is well laid out in the series of the volume of cars tells you have to address this. But we also have to recognize that for many people, and the Secretary mentioned this, there isn't, even at the end of the day, going to be another alternative. So cars or private transportation of some kind is going to be in the mix as you pick up people from further and further out. I would say that had we had a forum like this 10 years ago, the explosion of the Ubers and Lyfts would have left whatever smart things we said up on this stage 10 years ago wanting. So in doing the process of coming up with solutions, we have to recognize that there are future technology changes that no one's anticipated yet that's going to throw this all askew. So we have to try as best we can a number of solutions and then be prepared for the unexpected that puts us back at the drawing board.
So one of the things the series talked about was congestion pricing, and I'm going to read a passage from the Spotlight series. This is Secretary Pollack said the state would not consider imposing tolls to enter downtown unless Boston City Hall took that initiative. And so, Chris, Mayor Walsh actually sent you to London to check out congestion pricing, the congestion pricing system out there. So now you've come back, obviously. So what say you? I mean, do you think congestion pricing is something that the city of Boston should get behind?
So the simple answer is that this is something we should absolutely consider. I apologize. So now is a moment in our time where we have to be taking bold steps. And the mayor has made it very clear that we are going to be open to any idea that can address congestion, that can lower emissions, that can improve equity across our city, across the region, across the Commonwealth. There is a reason why, as you noted, I was able to travel actually with some other folks who are here over to London to learn more about their congestion pricing program. And similar to what has already been said, particularly by the Secretary, what was really interesting about the congestion pricing program in London is not only how it helped to actually enhance more people moving to and through the city of London, the downtown core itself, but it did it by not only looking at the charge, but also improving the choice. On top of the fantastic options they had already for the subway system, the overground, and the bus system, when they actually rolled out the congestion charge, they also increased the number of buses that were headed into the downtown core. They added 300 buses on the very day that it opened. And as was referenced in the piece, they actually have invested a tremendous amount in better bike infrastructure ever since then, which is why you're getting more people able to sort of access the City of London through the congestion pricing program. I think it's because of reasons of the success in places like London, places like Stockholm, that you hear so many municipal leaders, business advocates in this room, who are talking about new ways of thinking of pricing the road, including managing lanes, as the state has suggested. Which is why I think sort of in our region right now, the conversation in some ways is shifting from if roadway pricing or if new ways we price the road is something we should consider to what is the right way for us to craft a roadway pricing program that can be done sustainably and equitably, and would that really work to achieve the fundamental objective of addressing congestion in an equitable and sustainable way?
Secretary Pollack, would this state support the city of Boston in creating a congestion pricing scheme?
So congestion pricing is a means, it's not the end. The end is a city and a region where traffic works and people can get where they need to go. So it's a tool in the toolkit. It's not a silver bullet. It hasn't been a silver bullet. And the other thing that's worth pointing out is there are delightful cities for transportation that some of us have had the pleasure of being to, like Amsterdam. They don't use that tool in their toolkit. So we're looking at all the tools in the toolkit. Of course, we collaborate with the city of Boston all the time. I have a responsibility for 351 cities and towns. The Globe series was very focused on Boston and the immediate environs. There are parts of the Commonwealth where pricing the roads doesn't make any sense. And if we tried to, people would just divert off the priced roads. That's why we think something like managed lanes is a more productive way, because with managed lanes, right side by side, you have a lane that you price and you have a lane that you don't price. And that means it's not about forcing people or punishing people who have no choice. It's about choices. One of the interesting things that we learned from Maryland, which is using managed lanes, is that most of the users are not using managed lanes 10 times a week. They are actually getting bills of $20 or $30 a month. They use them the days it's worth their time and while to pay, and they don't use them the days they don't. And that strikes me as a much fairer way if we want to use pricing as a means to the end of addressing congestion than a system in which you have to pay every day, even if you had no choice but to drive that day.
If I could also, just so we keep the terminology distinct, congestion pricing, as I've seen it described and understand it in London and Stockholm, other places, is to affect behavior. It's not viewed as a revenue-raising option. And when we also use the phrase on road pricing or tolls or whatever you want to call them, you have to understand what the purpose is of a system like that. Are you trying to raise money as a substitute means for primarily today the gas tax in terms of your financial needs for the system? Or, again, as I understand congestion pricing, are you trying to affect behavior? The thing I'll note about the two cities that the Globe talked about, in Stockholm it was described as more limited roadways where the pricing occurs, and comparing that to Boston. We all know, perhaps some people in this room, people are very wily about, even for the sake of $1 or $2 on a trip, finding alternative means to travel through neighborhoods. And my sense is, in Boston, if you had a congestion pricing system that was limited to certain roadways, the traffic that we would then see in other places in the metro area would increase. So it's more likely, if you're talking about it, to impose it the way it was in London, I think it's like 400 different cameras at intersections, and that raises additional unrelated issues that people tend to be concerned about, which is nonstop traffic data collection of vehicles everywhere as you enter or leave the Boston area. And that has to be part of the discussion in balance as to where congestion ranks in that issue. So clearly, as the Secretary and others have said, these are very complicated issues. I happen to agree with the administration on the managed lanes. The information I've seen, I think it's in Seattle, most of the vehicles that use the system there tend to be pickup trucks for commercial purposes, who see the value to them of a more predictable, quicker ride, and they're willing to pay, and in some sense, I'm sure, pass that on to their customers. So the notion, the phrase has been out there, Lexus lanes. I don't think the information reflects that, the data, on who tends to use these, and as the Secretary said, and when.
So 75% of all the vehicles that come, or the emissions that are a part of the city of Boston, come from outside of Boston. There is an opportunity to look at congestion pricing or managed lane to reduce the number of cars coming into the city. We know it works. It's been done in Stockholm. It's been done in Amsterdam. It's been done in London. We know it's been done in Maryland. We have enough data that tells us whether we can try something piloted here and then course correct as needed. But to say that there's not an opportunity for us to be really looking at how we're going to get people out of their cars and use a tool that does change behavior, I almost feel like that's a little irresponsible. We do need to say, let's figure this out. And how do we do it? How do we test it? And then how do we course correct as needed? There's an opportunity to do that. Like, if something doesn't work, let's move on to the next thing. But we've got to stop talking about it, and we've got to try some stuff.
So on this issue of roadway pricing or congestion pricing, where are we? I mean, are we how do we get from the talking stage to actually piloting something?
So one of the things we pointed out in our congestion report is, and Chairman Strauss was making this point as well, first, we actually need to start making sure we're talking about the same thing, okay? In Massachusetts, we have roadway pricing in the form of tolls. They are paid by a very small number of people who happen to use a handful of roads. And statutorily, by state, not federal law, we collect money and only put the money back into those roads. If I were to do some kind of a pricing pilot tomorrow, I don't have the ability to take the money and use it the way London did to build bike facilities or to pay for more buses. So if we want to do congestion pricing, because people are assuming that the proceeds of that will go to provide the people with alternatives, we have to change, forget federal law, we have to change state law, even to make a pilot sensible, because people are not talking about it. The other thing is our gantries, which is what we use to do road pricing. What our congestion study showed is there are no gantries in the most congested locations in the region, and there are gantries in places that are not particularly congested. We cannot hijack a historic set of road pricing devices that happen to be in a handful of places and say that's now our pricing system. So if we want you ask the question, what would it take? I would say we need to change state law, and then we need to build a system for collecting the congestion pricing that is sensible given where congestion is, and we have to allow the use of the proceeds of that pricing to invest in alternatives. Otherwise, if people have to pay and they don't have another way to get where they're going, you're not pricing them, you're punishing them.
Chairman Strauss, I think there are road pricing bills in the legislature, just they don't get passed, right?
That's right. There are any number of proposals, and this wouldn't be the first session that has come up on this question of tolling in other places. Some versions, it would be all lanes, some the managed lane, where the drivers have the choice whether to pay that day or not. They would have, and I hate the word, the free option. It's really a no toll option. No access to the roadway is ultimately free. It's still subsidized in some fashion by different revenues. What has happened is the notion, and I've seen some floor votes over the years, there is a phrase that is commonly used, but those who use it often mean different things, about toll equity. Toll equity in Massachusetts used to mean eliminating all tolls on the historic turnpike. The phrase, I think, has morphed somewhat so that toll equity is for those who pay tolls on the turnpike corridor to know that other people are paying also and sharing in the joy of the tolls. But the difficult discussion that happens, and it's not really on a partisan basis, it's more on a geographical basis within the legislature, is that question of the raising of the revenue and then the determination of where it gets spent. Does it get spent where it's collected? Some who, in some parts of the state, that would be ideal. But in other parts of the state that don't necessarily have a good toll location available to them, they might be left out as well. So there has to be, as you often hear people like me say, there has to be a consensus that's developed about really, and again, this goes beyond the congestion issue, what is the next transition for funding the transportation system beyond that day when it comes, and the Globe wrote about this just the other day, when the gas tax as a component of the revenue we bring in isn't sufficient. And so that planning, I think, has to take place this session in terms of how we are going to find separate, distinct revenue options to support the transportation system. Not as what started our discussion, the altering of behavior with regard to congestion. Both these things need to be discussed and done simultaneously.
I know one solution you all agree on is unlocking the possibilities of the bus. you know, whether it's more bus-only lanes on city streets, perhaps bus-only lanes on state highways. Bus is so cool and comfortable. Mary, this gets back to you, what you were talking about, that you actually just want to be on the bus because it's so cool and fun to be on the bus. And there are cities where they have buses like that. I think we talked about it on a prep call in Seattle. So are we on the right track in terms of upgrading our buses? I mean, it seems like pretty low-hanging fruit. It seems like something that we can do in the next year or 2 years or 3 years and makes a huge difference in people's commutes. Or are we, like everything else, just still, there's just a lot of talk?
I can start. So I think we are on the right track, but we have far, far more to do. So as the secretary can speak much better to, more people take bus trips than take any other MBTA service. But currently, our bus service is less reliable than any other MBTA service. And that has as much to do about how you manage the fleet as it does about how municipalities like the city of Boston manage its streets. So we've been working together with actually a number of people in this room, both advocates and practitioners. And last year, we created the first new dedicated bus lane in the city of Boston, the first time in a generation. This year, the mayor created the first ever transit team for the city of Boston. We've been able to do 4 additional bus lanes here in the city. We have actually started the planning process to put bus lanes into some of the key corridors across the city of Boston and make bus improvements in some of those places where our residents are experiencing the most bus delays, things like Blue Hill Avenue, Warren Street, Columbus Ave, and more. All of that work is actually not just delivering sort of the spark of something, but it's actually delivering real results for riders today, which is why we're, I think, quite excited about accelerating that work in the years ahead, working actually with many of the people in this room, both in a collaboration between the city and the state, and also increasingly in a collaboration between municipalities, the city of Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Everett, working together to figure out how do we actually implement the right sort of solutions to move people on buses faster across our borders as well as within our cities.
So one of the challenges that we face in we all agree that buses are low-hanging fruit, but one of the challenges we face is congestion. So the T currently plans bus routes as if the bus is going to move at 9 miles an hour. It is pretty clear that if you have a choice of creeping along in your car or creeping along in a bus, people will creep along in their own car before they'll creep.
9 miles an hour?
Yes, that is
Wow.
design speed for most new bus routes. So we need to give the buses the ability to move faster, and that's bus lanes, but it's also traffic signal priority, and it's also little spaces where they can make a left turn ahead of the rest of the traffic, and lots of other things that we can do. The other thing that we have to do, and we've started this process, but again, is we need to look at the bus routes we have. I mean, before we go build infrastructure for the current routes, some of them, the top 15, which carry 4, so the T has 170 bus routes, but 15 carry roughly half of all the passengers, okay? So there's, 100 bus routes that we need to take a look at and say, is this the right route for the year 2020, not the year 1920, when it might have been a trolley route and we're still running the bus on the same route. All the cities that have seen real blossoming of their bus ridership have done these redesigns of the network. So we've started that process, but people, the primary constituency when you have something like the Better Bus Project that the T has been running for the last 3 years is current users of the bus, and they like it the way it is, by and large, and they don't want, just moving a bus stop a block is a major political lift. So suddenly saying we're going to take 100 routes and change them in order to create great buses is a pretty heavy lift. And so, one of the things you said in the first panel is, it's us, it is us. And part of the us is, if we want great buses, we absolutely can have great buses, but us are gonna all have to work together on those great buses because they're gonna look real different than the buses the T's been running for the last century, in some cases.
So I want to commend the work that the City of Boston and MassDOT has done to really focus on the bus. But the real benefit or the real applause goes to the advocates who decided that this year it was going to be the year of the bus. So organizations like Transportation for Massachusetts, Livable Streets Alliance, ITDP, decided to say, well, if we can have some change in our public transportation system, really make a difference in the next 1 to 3 years, where could we do it? And the focus was on the bus. While I acknowledge that doing some work is hard, I know that you got to take streets and you got to move the cars out of the street and make sure that the buses can go through the lanes. But we have seen that done where there's a good municipal and state collaboration, where there's enforcement of the lane, and where there's some political will to do it and do it quickly. Mexico City has bus rapid transit. They run on dedicated lanes. They have built 7 in the last 10 years. How many bus rapid transit lanes, how many bus rapid transit corridors do we have here in Greater Boston? 0. So there's something we need to be thinking about. If we're going to build these bus lanes, if we're going to do them, are we going to do them well? Are we going to do them right? And are we going to do them quickly? And I think we can do that.
As you said in phrasing the question, that was for you, not me. As you framed the question, we all do agree that the buses as an option is really has not been fully realized, and it does provide in a way the flexibility that I think everybody likes, where you can try an idea. If it doesn't work, the investment in terms of capital work is much reduced. But let's not kid ourselves. It's really tough. I think today's story about the road diet in West Roxbury is a perfect opening into what happens when, for the sake of other uses, whether it's bus, pedestrian, bicyclists, in the city of Boston or other built out more urban areas, in other municipalities where people are close in, where you will begin to have real estate wars. And what I mean by that is the conflicts over the space that is the public way. I like to think of transportation as something like another utility. Unlike the communications or the electrical system or the water system, this is, in a sense, offered free, even though it has cost, to the public. Go out in the public way. Historically, in Boston, of course, that was just the space between buildings where people had rights to travel. And then it became more complicated. When you talk about whether it's commuter rail or on the roads, it's really the same thing. It's the competition for access to the public space and how we provide for it. So buses will cause an improvement, but you will see, like you did in the paper today, anytime somebody steps forward and says, we're going to grab another lane of travel because something like bus rapid transit or whatever makes more sense for more people, you will have merchants or customers who say, whether they're right or wrong, no. And you will have these conflicts. And so I don't want anyone to think that as a result of walking out of here, you could say, well, buses, that was it. That sounds easy. It's probably going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be like one block at a time, these issues, I think, as they roll out.
Shirley, can I add one more thing? So the other thing that I think is really hard and needs to be part of the dialogue is you got to set priorities and decide, if our goal is to fix congestion in a way that is equitable and consistent with our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Because to me, you can't separate those 3 things. You have to decide where you're going to put your efforts. When we talk about fixing the T, and we get that people have a sense of urgency and want it to go faster. Historically, until pretty recently, people were, quite frankly, much more interested in rail-based transit than they were in buses. And I think one of the things the Spotlight series did, and I hope our congestion report did, and I hope that we can all do as a collective as we tackle these issues is, look at data and look at experiences in other places. So Denver and Los Angeles have spent billions on trains, and their total transit ridership is down after those investments because the loss of ridership on the buses actually wiped out the entire increase in rail ridership. And we're really excited about the commuter rail vision process that we've been running for 2 years, and the prospect of getting better use out of our commuter rail. And I'm not saying there should be a trade-off of one versus the other, but if you're talking about short term, here's a statistic everyone should remember. If we invest $20 or $30 billion and 10 or 15 years from now, we do all the things and we triple the ridership of all 14 existing commuter rail lines, they will still carry roughly the same number of people as the buses carry this week. And that's the bad buses without the bus lanes and the signal priority. and not bus rapid transit. So we need to, you know, there are bandwidth issues. Chris's folks are busy, my folks are busy. It's not just money. It is prioritization. We have been prioritizing buses. We love the idea of prioritizing buses. It is a collective decision which investments we choose to focus on in order to address congestion issues and improve our transit system.
So who gets to decide that? Who's the collective? I mean, this bus prioritizing buses sounds great. Sounds like something we should do.
Agreed. So that's actually, it's probably our biggest focus on planning right now is some of these major corridors around buses. So I think actually the building blocks are in place to do exactly what Mary said, to go from what we're doing today, which are really important and transformational changes using red paint, to things that actually are about transforming the experience, about finding the right routes to the Secretary's point, about putting in the right infrastructure to Mary's point, and doing it in ways that work well for the community. And I think that the incremental steps, and they are, at this point, they are the early days of I think, the future that we all want with buses, are helping to build that case. This is a very small example, and it is just about one block. We added one block of dedicated bus lane next to the Federal Reserve Bank. According to some of the riders, that has shortened their trip by 5 to 7 minutes. One block, 5 to 7 minutes. Imagine what we can do over longer corridors, and each of these blocks that we do allows us to actually think bigger and bigger with each step that we take.
But the other thing too, as you start thinking about the mode of travel, we know that people that ride buses tend to be older, younger, of color, with lower income. And so as we are thinking about how we are prioritizing our modes, we really want to say, are we covering transportation gaps for those people and in communities where it's most needed? I would suggest we start there.
I mean, this is a really good segue. I know some of you mentioned that you felt the series didn't delve enough into issues of race and equity in transportation. So how do we relieve congestion and make sure the solutions are equitable for all? In other words, what does a more equitable system look like?
Sure, so I can start with that. I mean, we are foregrounding, and this is really the mayor's interest, foregrounding equity in a lot of the work that we are doing. And building off of something the Secretary said, a key part of that is the plan for the rail vision. The rail vision is a transformative look at our commuter rail system that we have across this region. And because of the nature of congestion in our region, one where it is a huge amount of congestion that is being caused by people driving in from beyond 128, the commuter rail is a huge part about how we actually address congestion. What the future rail vision has advanced and what the Fiscal Management Control Board has approved is a vision that moves to a high-frequency, electrified, all-day service that is running throughout the commuter rail system. Now, as the Secretary mentioned, there are 14 lines, and it's going to take a while to get to each of those lines. So there's a question about where do you start. And for the City of Boston, where you start is incredibly clear. It is the Fairmount line. The Fairmount line is the line in the City of Boston that goes through our communities that have the longest commutes. It goes through our communities that are spending the highest share of wallet on transportation. Goes through our communities that have the highest percentage of residents who are low income, the highest number of youth. It is also the line in the commuter rail system where a majority of the riders are persons of color, and it is the line in our system that has the least frequency today. Without question, the line that we need to start with when we think about the transformation of the commuter rail system is the Fairmount line. And I think it's an example of how if you solve for equity, if you make that investment in the Fairmount line, it then becomes a model for how you transform the entirety of the commuter rail system, which is how you actually can help solve for congestion across the region.
So the thing about equity is we only address it if we're intentional about it. Otherwise, it's one of those things that gets lost. So before I was secretary, I worked at Northeastern, and we looked at the equity issue. And there's this fact that keeps getting quoted about the fact that black bus riders have longer commutes than white bus riders. I know where that fact comes from because it's my research. Here's the other fact that no one includes with that. Black drivers have longer commutes than white drivers. The fact is that we don't build enough housing that people can afford near the jobs that they're qualified to hold. That is the fundamental equity issue that shapes our transportation system. So it is equally hard if you drive as it is. Buses don't take longer for black people because they're slower or we give them crappier buses. It's because of the distance that you need to cover to get from a home. And that problem has only gotten worse. So people may not think that the Governor Baker's housing production bill by itself is enough, but it is a place to start. Transportation moves people from one place to another. The congestion that the Spotlight series talked about was primarily the congestion of the commute, and the commute is a trip from where you work to where you live. If we don't want to address where people live and where people work, we're not going to address equity in our transportation system.
The other thing I'd like to add in terms of the discussion of equity is, as the Secretary points out, the transportation system is really what is provided as a means for people to get around in different modes. It isn't just commuting to jobs. It's often, and I hear this from plenty of colleagues in rural parts of the state, it's also access to healthcare and to have the opportunity. And there are different systems out there in different regions of the state, but that someone, because their system is less well served, might have 2 or 3 hours of connections through transit connections to get to their nearest critical healthcare facility, even for a checkup. I don't mean emergency care, is something that we have to be mindful of and also recognize. When I was talking about the free part of the system, it's only free in the sense that you may not be paying a toll at that moment, but the system still costs money. And some parts of the transportation system that we have a responsibility to provide will not show that perfect business person's profit and loss balance sheet. Some of these things will cost more money. You will have bad ridership in certain underserved areas of the Commonwealth because there aren't many people. But that doesn't mean we abandon the routes. It's their only alternative to get around, not just to work, but as I say, for family members or for healthcare needs.
Mary, do you want to add anything? Or, okay. Along the same lines, what about this idea of making the MBTA free or even parts of it free? Would that make the system more equitable? Would that make the system get more people out of their cars?
Sure, so I'll start. Certainly, lower fares will get more riders, particularly low-income riders, to ride more frequently. Jeff Rosenblum's research that recently came out of MIT really reinforced that point. It's one of the reasons why we worked with the state to ensure that there was no increase in passes for seniors, passes for youth, the cost of a bus pass. And there's a reason why the mayor invested roughly $7 million to ensure that every 7th to 12th grader in the city of Boston has a free MBTA pass over the course of their school year. It's also why we're supportive of the work which the T is now doing to do a low-income fare study, looking at this question more deeply. It is also clear, though, from the Spotlight series that lower fares themselves are not the only way in which we can actually address congestion, and themselves will not actually be able to fully address congestion. And just thinking of something which came up in the previous panel, I think you see this very clearly with Uber and Lyft, with TNCs. As Nicole, I think, said, there were 42 million trips that started in the city of Boston last year by Uber or Lyft. As Adam will frequently say, as Adam Vaccaro will frequently say, that is more than one a second. There are about like 300 people in this room. 300 people in the last 5 minutes have taken an Uber or Lyft in the city of Boston. Last 5 minutes, this entire room, that equivalent, has hailed an Uber or Lyft in the city of Boston at one a second. It is a huge portion of what is the way in which people are traveling in our city. And MAPC has done a lot of work to document who is actually choosing to take an Uber or Lyft. And a lot of them are people who would have walked, biked, or take mass transit, things that were accessible and things that were likely more affordable. So it's clear that if we actually want to be able to get more people to shift to those modes, that we are really going to sort of address congestion, walking, biking, and mass transit. It's not just about looking at fares, it's also about making those alternatives better, making transit more reliable, more accessible, more frequent, and making walking and biking more safe and more comfortable for more people.
So if we are going to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals in the state of Massachusetts, we have to get approximately 140,000 people out of their cars. Other than that, we're not going to meet our climate goals. There are many ways in which we could be looking at doing that don't require massive investments in public transit, at least in the near future. One thing is we have transportation demand management. We can ask our private sector and our companies to do more to get people out of their cars. We saw in the Spotlight series that MIT had this great program that what they did is they had people pay for parking and they gave them their transit pass. And as a result, they saw ridership go up on public transit. We also have seen that Kendall Square Association just launched a project called Transportation Advance. I think your series talked about it as well. And it's how do you get those large employers throughout the Commonwealth to pilot different projects and activities that get people out of their cars. So they're going to be piloting electric bikes so that people can do more biking. They're going to be piloting car share. They're going to be piloting a number of activities. And they have 19 of the organizations in Kendall Square have agreed to participate in this pilot. It represents 23,000 people. And again, this is an example of something that can be done locally, that's done at the private sector, and that doesn't cost an incredible amount of money, but begins to change behavior and help people think differently about how they're moving. I think that's one solution we should be looking at, in addition to a number of others. I do think we do need to make public transit at least free, if not low cost. If you're a senior citizen, if you're young, if you're low income, you should be able to ride public transit without paying an exorbitant amount.
Right, so the key is the affordability of transit matters. We currently discount transit for seniors, regardless of income. We currently discount transit at the T and at our RTAs for anyone who's disabled. Those are statutory. The control board chose to create a new discount program for low-income youth up to age 25. That program is wildly underutilized, and we were able to work with the city of Boston to come up with a sharply discount in the price of the student pass that allowed the city to be able to afford it. But people do need to step up because if transit agencies are forced to internally cross-subsidize the affordability, it actually runs the risk that with less revenue from fares, it will degrade service. The Transit Center in New York, which does great research, says even among low-income riders, their number one request is better service, not lower fares.
The only thing I'd add is, again, the use of the word free is always misleading. And as I said, in a sense, many people who use the roads think of them as being free because they don't pay anything for that trip, but the cost is there. So clearly from the goal of congestion, climate goals, getting people out of their cars, something along even individual corridors, which some cities use, can be a free ride, not across the whole system, but certain areas. Denver is one that comes to mind. So that can be done, but remember, basic operating budget, I think about $2 billion a year, depending on how you define it. A state of good repair need, that means additional work to bring it to the system that people want to be able to rely on, another $8 to $10 billion. So declaring the T free in and of itself obviously doesn't accomplish the long-term goals.
So we're going to move into our Q&A portion from audience questions that we've gathered online and in person. Here's one from right here inside Faneuil Hall. Why are all the price increases falling on transit users and not drivers?
So I'm going to quote some research that Transportation for Massachusetts has done, but we haven't priced our roads adequately or equitably or fairly. And so there have been a number of increases on public transit, and while those increases have happened, we haven't thought about how we're going to increase or make the cost of driving more expensive as well.
I think similar, just to add to that, recently, not only a coalition of municipalities, a coalition of advocates, and a coalition of businesses all separately endorsed increases in the gas tax, updates and increases to TNC fees, the advancement of things like regional ballot initiatives. But to Mary's point, particularly on something like gas taxes, allows us to actually think about how we raise revenue that actually can improve the experience for people, whether they're behind the wheel, on a bus, on foot, or by bike, and that those sort of investments and those sort of sources of revenue are incredibly important for our work going forward.
And I would just add, in terms of certainly you can't put the cost of the system on any one part of it. So fares is part of a mix, and when you, regardless of mode really, and you look at the gas tax since 1991, even with a partial 3-cent increase 4 years ago, the purchasing power, or how much that has eroded, is 40% since 1991. And so, in a sense, that has fallen behind, as frankly, I think the fares had. For many years, it had been a long time since there was any increase at all. So everyone has to be asked to be part of it. And so what clearly has happened is fares increases occurred. We're all well aware of that. I would think the chances are infinitesimal that there would be any changes of fare in anything that the legislature does this session.
What about the gas? Do you think the legislature will increase the gas tax this session?
I always love the chance to talk for 200 people. It's an unknown because you have basic civics, obviously, 160 members of the House, 40 members of the Senate, each from their different constituencies that they ultimately answer to, and each with the perfect solution in mind. But you can only put one bill on the governor's desk. So gas tax is certainly part of what is being talked about. What, when you add the input of 200 people, is the result? And then, of course, the governor has a special role in that discussion. I couldn't say.
What about you?
Oh, I'm in favor of it. My experience in looking at the 40% erosion in what the gas tax is able to buy right now, its efficiency from a tax collection standpoint, and its notion that the roads have costs too, and just like the transit system has costs as well, means that users of the system in some fashion have to expect to contribute to the cost of maintaining that system.
So this is a question that came online and also in person here. So why didn't the series speak to the lack of traffic law enforcement? Isn't that a good starting point to fixing the problem? And there's something very specific. Why aren't we enforcing more bus lanes like in New York City? Why not enforce don't block the box with $250 fines and 2 points? Yes.
So I certainly agree that enforcement is a critical part of the way in which we actually get people to move safely and reliably through our city. It's about engineering, it's about enforcement, it's about education. On bus lanes, there's actually been some increased coordination between the city and the state, specific to our bus lanes, both between the MBTA police, the Boston Police, and the Boston Transportation Department, really to make sure that the investments we're making in creating these lanes and the reliability that they're providing on day one is sustained over time. We want to make sure that they are not degrading, and so it's some work which we are stepping up of late, focused specifically on that. Thinking about Don't Block the Box, a part of the mayor's legislative agenda is actually to advance something which would allow us to pilot photo enforcement for Don't Block the Box. This is something which we'd want to try out at a number of critical intersections, many of which you know. And as our police department would say, in Don't Block the Box intersections, it's actually a very difficult place to pull somebody over. So what we want to be able to do is see if we can advance photo enforcement to allow us to actually manage those particular intersections better.
Thanks. From the reason the series didn't address it is, I mean, it was certainly something that we looked at. There was one editor in particular who I think he wanted the entire series just to be about lack of enforcement. And I certainly understand that just as a driver and a bus rider. I mean, I was sending photos to the team for a while every night on my commute on the way home of the Ubers taking up my bus stop. which was causing traffic to kind of cascade backwards. Certainly the camera thing is one option. I know that has something that's been pushed by the city for a long, long time, and Chris, you probably know this, going back to Mayor Menino. I think that has, it's almost been a perennial bill to get some sort of camera enforcement. I'm sure there's people who on the stage who might know better why those have gone nowhere. I know at one point there was some opposition from public safety unions. I don't know if that is still a sticking point. But that certainly could be an issue. But there's no question that is. This is not going to be our last series on, or our last story looking at transportation. And enforcement would be something definitely ripe to dig into.
So we got a lot of questions about biking, and the series didn't address biking. Of course, it could have been like a month-long series if we got to all the topics. But so this is one from the audience. As a daily bike commuter, the increased traffic has a safety impact on me. In the spirit of getting people out of cars, how is the city, I assume this is the city of Boston, but it could be any city, I guess, plan to incorporate biking as a near-term transit option as leading European cities are?
It's a great question. Part of our Go Boston 2030 plan, the mayor's long-term plan for transportation, is to quadruple the percentage of people who bike to work in the city of Boston. And that, to the spirit of this question, is really about putting in a commuter bike network that more people are actually comfortable using, and about connecting the pieces of that network that we have today. We are putting more money behind that. We've been able to actually double our staff that is focused specifically on active transportation, our engineering and planning staff, to accelerate this work. We've been able to increase the capital budget as well, and that is why we've been able to go from essentially under 2 miles of protected bike lanes when the mayor started to 8 miles today, to double that, which are on the drawing board. Obviously, there's far, far more to do. The next 2 stretches that we are focused on are the Mass Ave corridor that would connect essentially Dorchester Avenue and Melnia Cass, connecting residents from Dorchester into the Melnia Cass bike path, as well as the South Bay Harbor Trail, and some of the other destinations from that point, as well as improving what we're calling sort of connect downtown. This would help people who use the Southwest corridor today be able to get further into some of the destinations in downtown by making some improvements along corridors like Columbus Ave and Charles Street, and both the planning processes for that have improved and have started. I would encourage people who want to get engaged in this. Your voice matters a great deal in this process. Our team is running lots of public meetings on this. I encourage you to either reach out to me or reach out to the team. We'd love to connect with you and make this work go even faster.
One of the benefits we have as a foundation is we're often able to bring people from across the world that have experience in sustainability and mobility and how we're thinking about moving people. And last week we had the pleasure of having Gil Peñalosa here, and he's the founder of 880 Cities. And one of the things he talked about is in Bogota, Colombia, how they did this program, and they now have 700 miles of dedicated bike lane. 700 miles. And part of the way they did that is they created these networks. They have the bike lanes connect to a place, and more people ride them. And so he's talking about a system that gets people where they need to go, that's safe, so that it encourages people to actually use it, and that actually traverses the entire city of Bogota. When we talk about 700 miles, that's a real bike network, and we need to be talking in numbers that large. We need to be that ambitious and that aggressive and that bold, because if we can get there, we can get more people to ride bikes.
The only thing I'd add in the discussion is, you can tell already from the comments, the bike issue is safety, and it's also access to the pavement. And I would say the administration's done a fabulous job focusing not just on the city areas, but some of the rural areas, with added mile-by-mile additions to these networks, because the goal, of course, is that these be transportation alternatives, and you need them to hit a dynamic point where people view them that way as a transportation alternative, not just for the recreation. We've tried each session, we did earlier this session, to focus on some of the safety issues and the lane and right-of-way issues. One bill the committee has always supported is in dealing with the larger trucks, the safety guards underneath. the tragedies that everyone sadly gets to read about all too often could be in a large part addressed with that added feature on not all trucks, but certain kinds. And that's one that we've always supported because the need is clear and the remedy seems to be quite clear.
Secretary Pollack, can you talk a little bit about outside of Boston? Do you feel that cycling is growing? And
So, the Spotlight series focused a lot on the commute. One of the things our congestion study found is that congestion is not just an issue during commuting hours. It's a weekday, it's a weeknight issue, it's a weekend issue, it's more of the hours of the day. And one of the real opportunities that we have to address both congestion and climate, which is, to me, those are the equally important C words, is what we called in our statewide bicycle and pedestrian plans that we just completed, everyday walking and biking. So bike commuters are really important and networks are really important, but there's a real opportunity, and this kind of goes to we all have to change kind of our behavior. There's a lot of short trips that we all make in cars, and by cars I include Ubers, because those are cars, that we could be making by biking and walking. So the national statistic is of trips of half a mile or less, 1/3 of them are driven, right? So in a world in which all trips that were half a mile or less, people walk, bike, or use transit, that would make a big difference both to congestion, local congestion, as well as to greenhouse gases. So our statewide bike and walking plans both focus on what we call everyday walking and biking. How do you make it possible, not just to commute by biking or walking, but for your kid to go to the library after school, for a senior citizen to be able to walk from where they live to someplace that they can meet a friend for a meal. And one of the ways that we started is just incorporating biking and walking accommodations into everything we build. And now the key is we have to connect all those sort of little pieces into actual networks that get people where they're going to need to go. But there's a huge amount of potential. But what we need is people to be safe when they walk and bike, but we also need people to feel safe when they walk and bike. And there are two different things. And our Complete Streets program has really focused on both of those things.
I think we're almost, okay, I got 5 more, I've got one more question. All right, thanks. Thanks, Mary. Anyways, this is another question from the audience here at Faneuil Hall. A challenge of this scope demands regional solutions. Given the balkanization of jurisdictions in the Metro Boston area, how can we collaborate across municipalities, and what models do we have for that?
So I think one of the challenges that we have in Massachusetts is the places where there are better regional models. It's not just that they have ballot initiatives or they do transportation. Those regions exist as regions. They actually do other things as regions. They do land use planning, they do transportation planning. Some of them work on education issues. And so when a regional entity that is actually a council of government tackles transportation, they tackle it in a room where people are used to working. We really don't have regional government in Massachusetts. We don't have regions. We don't have counties. And so, I agree we have to do a better job of working across it, but I would caution people from looking in other places and saying, why can't we do that? Asking yourselves, yeah, but how do you do regional work or work across municipalities in a state where those municipalities are actually not working with each other on a daily basis through an organized system of regional government? Because we just, it is a big challenge. That said, we work with the metropolitan planning organizations, and MassDOT tries really hard to work not just with individual cities and towns, but with regions. So if there's more than we can be doing it, we can be doing it. But it is a challenge in Massachusetts, where we have 351 cities and towns, and they have 351, ideas each for themselves about, what would fix the transportation system. And some of those ideas are actually sort of moving things to an adjacent community, not really solving the underlying problem. We just have to do better.
I think just a quick bright spot of where municipalities are working together, to the Secretary's point, that is sort of the foundation to allow us to do more, is actually the public bike share system, the Blue Bike program. This is a collaboration between Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, Somerville, and Everett. The program is expanding at a remarkable rate. Last year we had 1.7 million rides, which was our highest ever. I think we only had one day over 10,000 rides last year. Our new high, our daily high is 13,000 and above. We're at 2.2 million rides on the Blue Bike system over the course of this year, and we're going to break that number, I'm sure, next year. That collaboration between those 5 municipalities in some ways allows us to have a foundation to do more. And as the Secretary referenced, I think there's an opportunity for us to give municipalities tools that allow us to identify ways we can collaborate in infrastructure that we want and transportation solutions that we know that the public wants. And that's through the Regional Ballot Initiative. Mayor Walsh just came back from LA. One of the things that LA County did as a region is they voted on something called Measure M. This was a collective decision, a public ballot, to vote on a set of transportation improvements. $120 billion worth of transportation improvements to be done over the next 40 years that were publicly voted on through an authority that they have in California that we've been seeking here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts through something called regional ballot initiatives. I think we get that sort of tool here in Boston, where it was put to a public vote. You would decide the things we were investing in and the ways in which we were raising that revenue. It would give us the sort of local control and the local opportunity to be able to work as a region or as a collective of municipalities to be able to get done the things that you think are going to best solve congestion.
So one of the things we've been talking a lot about at the Barr Foundation is that us, the collective, we have a defeatist strategy. I mean, a defeatist perspective. Oftentimes, when I come into the office or I'm somewhere, wherever, people always tell me about what's wrong with the transit system. Like, it doesn't work. I got stuck today. I mean, I did it this morning. I came in grumbling about how bad my commute was. And part of what we're trying to get people to do is change the narrative. Don't talk about what's not working. Tell us about what can work. Help us think about the kind of system you want. When you see your elected officials are really doing the kinds of transportation improvements, give them the shout outs that they need. Because in order for us to get the kind of political will that we want to accelerate progress, we actually need you as the public to say, we want this, we deserve this, and we want more. And a lot of that is changing the language and changing the narrative. So I want to, if this is my last time at the mic, I think it's really important to say, talk about what this system can deliver and what you want it to be for you. And that also provides wind behind the sails of the folks on the ground that are trying to make this happen.
I think that's a great way to end this panel. I want to thank all our panelists, Chris Osgood from the City of Boston, Secretary Pollack, Mary Skelton Roberts from the Barr Foundation, Chairman Strauss, Adam Vaccaro, Andrew Ryan, and Nicole Dungca from the Globe. And thank you to all of you for trekking out through the snow. Please be careful walking back, and hopefully everybody will be taking the tea back. Anyways, thank you, everyone.